So if back in Cataclysm you felt the Alliance was getting the short end of the stick, and if you ever felt that Garrosh's super villain transformation in MoP was weird, you were completely right. We just got an incredibly interesting insight from a former lead Blizzard developer that created a storyline that addresses the whole mess that was the faction storyline of the Southern Barons, and how the criticism from the players led to them turning Garrosh from a guy with some bad sides but still honorable to a complete monster that just ended up consuming a heart of an old god, and this was all really done to appease Alliance fans. So let's look at this insight, how this bit of storyline from Cataclysm impacted World of Warcraft all the way up to the World Soul Saga. While having the best deals on the market for all games and software, Gamivo just added mobile top-ups for your favorite mobile games with the best prices that you can get with my Gamivo link in the description below. Best of all, if you use my code DORON, your discount will be even bigger, so make sure to use my link in the description and the code and check out Gamivo. So, for all of you more old school players, you might remember some of the old criticism and the old storylines from Cataclysm that lead all the way up to today, and it is crazy how certain questlines all the way from Cataclysm impacted the factions pretty much up to the World Soul Saga. So, the information that I'm basing this on is from Dave Kosak, one of the lead Blizzard developers and one of the quest designers back from Cataclysm, as he reveals some really insightful behind the scenes information about how they created a storyline and why Garrosh turned out evil, and it's really interesting because what a lot of people thought was happening back then ended up being actually the case. So it starts all the way back in 2009 while they're building the Cataclysm, which by that point was the most ambitious expansion they had ever built, giving us a whole world revamp but also pretty big war that started spiraling out of control pretty much all the way until the Shadowlands, which did kinda come out of nowhere, as while there was the Vradgate event. The Horde and the Alliance mainly worked together by that point to fight the bigger evils. There wasn't really a crazy all-out war where they were throwing out shocking mana bombs at each other and sacking each other's capitals. So Dave talks about Southern Barons and how that ended up being a point of criticism and hate from the Alliance players and why it played out as it did. As you may remember, Southern Barons after the Cataclysm revamp was a completely different zone and a giant battlefield between the Horde and the Alliance, where Alliance for one of the first times actually started committing war crimes, and the battles were pretty intense. The dev talks about how they started it out as a regular WoW zone with adventure and all, until it slowly started spiraling out into insanity, betrayals happened, and everyone is just suddenly pulled into the war whether they want to or not. Level-headed leaders from both sides are replaced by zealots, and atrocities start happening from both sides. Essentially, chaos ensues. Now the main issue was with the Cataclysm, the Alliance has lost a lot more than the Horde. Literally, the Horde got a giant fortress metal reinforced Orgrimmar, while Stormwind was destroyed by Deathwing. He lost an entire part of it, it ended up being weakened. However, all over Azeroth, the Alliance started losing influence, their footing, the base operations, while the Horde really spread and it got stronger. So they wanted to equal it out a little bit with the Southern Barons on Kalimdor, with the Alliance now on the offensive, with the Alliance destroying the Horde bases, but it ended up just not making it much better, which brought a lot of criticism. First off, the Alliance destroys a pretty important Horde point, Camp Torajo, but this happens off-screen. However, the attack on Baal Modan ends up being more satisfying for the players than the Goblin camp that was subsequently attacked as well. Overall, the entire point was that the Southern Barons was supposed to be morally grey. No one is a good guy, but even the dev admits that the criticism was right, that the Alliance really ended up taking the short end of the stick here. They were pretty much reacting almost all the time to the Horde actions, while the Horde was a lot more proactive. The Alliance ending for the zone just didn't have the same closure that the Horde storyline got, so the Cataclysm criticism that the Alliance was getting wrecked was actually pretty legit. Blizzard acknowledged that, and the beatdown they got in the Southern Barons just made things even worse. They were hoping people wouldn't complain about it, but they did, so they decided to make things a little different, and this is what led to Mists of Pandaria and what made Garrosh the bad guy. Because of this exact criticism, they decided to give one to the Alliance, but honestly, I feel like this went way out of proportion. I mean, this is the main reason why they decided to turn Garrosh into a completely bad guy, and they wanted to give the Alliance a feel like they were now the ones laying the beatdown, so they almost immediately planned to have them actually invade the capital of the Horde and to depose of the War Chief. Now, this reveal actually explains a lot of inconsistencies we've previously had that we've suspected. I mean, if you followed the story back then, you might remember that Garrosh kinda turned crazy evil essentially overnight, and some of his actions never really made sense. They were inconsistent, like literally he just decided to conquer the entirety of Azeroth and to eradicate the infidels overnight. Let's be real, Garrosh was never a stereotypical good guy, never the reasonable guy that Troll was, for example. However, initially, when they introduced him back in TBC and in Outland and in Wrath, he was more of a hot-headed guy with good intentions, an honorable orc with a big burden. He had a lot of trauma with the legacy of his father Grom Hellscream's crimes and what he did for their people, so he was more confused than an angry orc that just didn't want to go the same route. This is all evident with things that happened before. First, he led the expedition in Northrend and was more hot-headed. Saurfang was the voice of reason, but he overall did a pretty good job there. I mean, that is one of the reasons why Troll even gave him the mantle of the War Chief. He helped us defeat the Lich King and the Scourge. Even that duel that he had prior to Cataclysm with Cairn when he became the War Chief, it was more really Cairn at fault initially for having that happen in the first place. Garrosh didn't really want to duel an old guy, but Cairn just didn't like Garrosh, and they ended up in a duel, and Cairn would have actually beat him, but the axe ended up being poisoned. Garrosh at that point was honorable. He took no enjoyment in the fact that someone poisoned his weapon without him knowing. He hated Megatha for doing that. After that, he led into war in Cataclysm, but it was more of an actual war, a more controlled war that made sense. There was even that storyline where he threw his commander off the cliff because he committed crimes, attacked those druids, and he fought without honor, so Garrosh decided to punish him. Sure, here he already started doing some crazy things like bringing in the Magnator from Northrend, attacking the Night Elves. Nonetheless, this is more of an aggressive, hot-headed war chief, and his actions made sense. He needed the resources and he wanted to expand the influence of the Horde. However, you might have noticed that since that point, especially midst of Pandaria, despite some villain side that was hiding, Garrosh just went absolutely insane. He started mana bombing a whole town full of civilians. He destroyed an entire zone in Pandaria with his old god energy. He started putting people on stakes, exiled everyone other than the orcs, and then he literally took the heart of an old god, an ancient old god, and turned himself into an absolute monster. Now, this entire transformation makes sense because they wanted to make it up to the Alliance players for the Cataclysm storyline, so unfortunately, Garrosh was the one that had to be sacrificed. Interesting enough, what a lot of people don't notice is that from that point forward, Horde went on a villain spiral that literally just got fixed, with them constantly doing something really bad while the Alliance was mainly the good guy on the sidelines. We literally had another invasion of Orgrimmar just a few years later with Sylvanas. Now, Dave Kosak actually explains how the entire Myths of Pandaria was inspired by the Southern Baron storyline of faction conflict and zealots leading the entire expedition instead of actual level-headed leaders. How they're fighting for the territory, how both sides are doing the crazy things. Unfortunately though for the Alliance, to get some W's, Garrosh had to be sacrificed and Orgrimmar had to be sacked as well. I would say this would have been decently reasonable, but I do think Blizzard went a little bit overboard here. I mean, they kind of overcorrected. I mean, back in MoP, they really turned the Horde into just an all-out bad guys, and Garrosh at that point really had zero redeeming qualities. However, I would say that it would have been settled, but unfortunately, as they had changes in leadership and all that, it really did hurt the Horde. We then got Vol'jin, who literally did nothing, and then Sylvanas, the puppet of the Grand Schemer Zovaal from the Shadowlands, that ended up controlling the Horde. So, because of some random guys complaining on a forum back in 2010, some Alliance fans, the Horde ended up getting wrecked for the next 10 years in order to even out the odds. Now, the things have kind of reset since then. Huge changes happened in Blizzard, so who knows where the tides will take us. There have been interviews of how faction conflict will happen again, but literally everything currently happening in the game shows that the factions are united, so some unstable times are definitely ahead. Thanks for watching. Check out my video on some actual leaks we got from Midnight by clicking on the screen, and check out my raid channel by clicking on the screen as well. See you next time!